Man is a religious animal. He is the only religious animal. He is the only animal that has the true religion. Several of them. This was said by American novelist and philosopher Mark Twain in his essay, The Lowest Animal. Kinda seems fitting that one of the most recognized American figures would speak so clearly and on the nose of one of America's most contentious issues God. From politics to creating the most pivotal moments in national history, finding the way to God has been one of the most defined features in the construction of modern Americana, for better or for worse. In its genesis, the indigenous natives practiced a wide array of various spiritual beliefs that focused strongly on elements of nature and reverence and respect for ancestry, as is common in paganistic denominations internationally. From there, Puritans and Pilgrims came to the shores of North America looking for a place to practice their own fringe Christian-based religions. Sephardic Judaism was introduced to New Amsterdam in the mid-17th century, which was later replaced as the majority by a wave of Ashkenazi Jews in the northeast region about 100 years later. The Catholic migrants were exclusively linked with the arrival of Spanish and French colonists and only made their way to the Northeast after the colonization of Maryland, which was used as a royal charter for King Charles I. Maryland was intended to act as a safe haven for Roman Catholics in England who had to practice their religion in secret for long periods of time due to the volatile relationship of religion and politics in Britain at that time. Islam has been the fabric of the United States for a lot longer than most people would think. So, some historians estimate as early as the 15th century there have been practicing Islamic explorers in North America, whereas others argue that Islam first became regularly practiced in the 17th century in what we would now consider to be Arizona and New Mexico by the Moors who were living in Spanish occupied territory. The third president of the United States and writer of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, even owned a copy of the Quran that he would read in tandem with a copy of the Christian Bible. Hinduism was introduced to the United States by Swami Vivekananda in his address to the World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893. Since then, millions of immigrants from India into the United States have helped popularize the religion. Similarly, many Eastern ideas and religions became populated in the US through massive immigration from various Eastern nations such as China, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, and many more throughout the years, mainly starting in the 19th century. But America, much like the young, who are always hungry for more, didn't settle for already established religions. The United States formed and was the home base for many religions that are still recognized worldwide to this day. Which brings us to our first story and the never-ending chapter of ideas that is the transient, restless beehive we call the United States. Voodoo. Yep, voodooism is practiced in parts of the United States. No, voodooism itself didn't necessarily start in the US, but American voodoo, or specifically New Orleans voodoo, did. Religions, like ideas, grow and change as they are exposed to other ideas and cultures. This was exactly the case on how voodoo changed when it reached the shores of the United States. So, where did voodoo actually start? For that answer, you have to go all the way back to Western Africa. Voodoo, where the word voodoo is derived from, means spirit. Like the aforementioned Native Americans, indigenous Africans had their own beliefs that were grounded in reverence for nature, using natural elements, honoring the ancestors, and believing in multiple spirits that acted as both agents of good and bad, not too dissimilar from ancient Greece's ideas on their own gods. During the slave trade, millions of Africans were forcibly brought to North and South America as well as the Caribbean. But it's hard to kill an idea, especially if that idea gives one hope and connects them to their home and family. So, ideas of African paganism continued to flourish among high concentrations of displaced Africans throughout the Americas and Caribbean as slaves could continue to practice their beliefs amongst each other. However, this became a problem when various types of Europeans perceived any non-monotheistic religion as inherently evil. The French were among these European groups. Now, there were many motivations for this, not all being the fire and brimstone motive. Some French and Spanish colonists wanted uniformity in the religion because they had seen to what happened in England during the tumultuous years of the Protestant Reformation under King Henry VIII and the creation of the Church in England, also known as Anglicanism. and they didn't want the same witch hunt happening among their own people. It was hard enough trying to colonize a foreign land with unrecognizable flora, fauna, and other competing European nations that would shoot at you if you went too far into their territory. So why make it harder by having fighting amongst your own people? Others had a more missionary perspective and felt that they were saving souls, giving hope to the perceived hopeless by telling them about the love of God. Of course, this message of love got a little lost in translation given that the slaves were stripped of their freedom, basic human rights, and their homes. But nevertheless, the message of hope did give comfort to some people who had little else to comfort them in their time of pain. Lastly, some people wanted everyone to be the same religion because it created a uniformed front that helped establish a stronger national identity and patriotism. Why fight for your country when you can fight for your country because God says so? It makes for a more powerful incentive for a military that's just been tasked to expand its territory that probably doesn't want to trudge through 3 feet of snow with no coat on for 130 miles. Thus the beginnings of converting Afro-Caribbean slaves to Catholicism in Spanish and French territories began. The English and Dutch territories had long been doing the same with Protestant Christianity. So where does New Orleans fit into all of this? Well, at the time, New Orleans and Louisiana as a whole was French territory, which is why Louisiana has the name that it does. It was named after the King of France at the time, King Louis XIV. France was having a hard time already populating Louisiana with French citizens because, surprisingly, most people don't want to move to an unfamiliar, extremely hot land filled with alligators, mosquitoes, and swampland that makes growing crops pretty difficult for your average French farmer. Now, this played a pretty big factor as to why the French government turned somewhat of a blind eye to who exactly was living and working in southern Louisiana at the time: French pirates. So, officially, pirates were no good hooligans in the eyes of the French and European rulers. Unofficially, pirates were used as paid labor for under-the-table deals more often than probably any government would care to admit. New Orleans, being the perfect waterway trade route at the base of the Mississippi River, became a safe haven for pirates, prostitutes, and con artists. A very proud tradition still carried on in New Orleans to this day. The location and trading were just too perfect for some wealthy classes to pass up. It was a great investment. So, with pirates and vagabonds holding up the fort, keeping some sort of an economy, both legal and illegal, functioning in the area, more people from the merchant and wealthy classes came into the city and developed more within the city. These people had the money to hire employees to run their plantations and estates. Instead, they bought slaves and kidnapped them and made them work for free. Many plantations and wealthy merchant estates were run by slaves that primarily came from the Caribbean, particularly Haiti, due to its close proximity, as well as Haiti's status of also being a French and then former French colony after the uprising. So, what happens when you mix Caribbean African inspired paganism with French and later Spanish Catholicism? Welcome to New Orleans Voodoo, where the saints get worshipped in more ways than one. So you would think that Catholic Christianity would be at complete odds with African paganism, or any paganism for that matter. But the slaves disagreed. While they were being told to worship one god instead of many, they did actually see parallels in their multiple gods and spirits and the saints and the martyrs of the Catholic Church. For those of you who don't know what a saint is a real person who did exist in history at one point and devoted their lives to God. In death, they're honored and used as an example, almost as like a folk hero of sorts for other Christians on how to live a godly life. Often, saints will be depicted with certain symbols that represent them or what they did in life. This was initially used because throughout most of history, most people were illiterate, so symbolism worked greatly in the Catholic Church's favor during the spread of early Christianity. Slaves were generally not permitted to receive a formal education, although the French were a lot more lenient about this than the English were. Many of them were not taught how to read, so like the early Christians, they relied a lot on visual aids. When the slaves were shown pictures of saints, people who lived their lives through example, there were some parallels that made a lot of them feel at home. For example, St. Peter was a disciple of Christ during his life. St. Peter believed that Jesus was the Messiah and spread the idea that Christ was the Savior and his gospel should be followed. This subsequent religion from this idea was later referred to as Christianity, meaning those who follow Christ. It would later be referred to as Roman Catholicism when many branches of Christianity would be created after the Protestant, or those who protest, Reformation came to be. They say St. Peter stands at the gates of heaven and greets the recently dead. As a result, he is always depicted with a key in his hand to let people know who he is. Incidentally, Papa Legba, one of the African spirits that's said to bring the dead to the afterlife, he too was always depicted with a key. Additionally, Azealia Dantor, a voodoo goddess, was often paralleled with the Virgin Mary due to her representation of love, femininity, compassion, grace, and most of all, motherhood. Voodoo practitioners saw Azealia and Mary for her beauty and motherhood that gave them a strong sense of cultural preservation and comfort, whether the Europeans liked that or not. This merging of traditional Afro-Caribbean voodoo with Franco-Spanish Catholicism morphed into what we now recognize as modern-day voodoo. Voodoo is commonly practiced in southern Louisiana, with over 15% of the population identifying as full-time practicing voodoo members. With its rich heritage, it's no wonder that voodoo is still practiced in parts of the U.S. today, being one of many threads in the fabric of America's various belief systems.